Okay, so thank you all for being here. I apologize that I was late. Sometimes things happen, right? I'm sure at some point in the semester you'll be late too, so here's your free pass, right? Okay, so today we're going to work on exercise 105, which is all about the next kind of level of advancement in the world of Photoshop, and it's something called blending modes. And so I'm going to show a few slides here to try to illustrate what blending modes are and how they work and kind of give you an overview of it. Only about 8 slides today. And then we'll move into kind of a live demonstration with a file that I'll have you download from the course website so that you can see what actually happens in a very controlled environment. I noticed when I was walking around that a lot of you have already downloaded the file, which is great. I'll obviously walk you through where to find it, and then we'll go through the details as we go forward. So blending modes essentially are a little difficult to explain. But basically what it is when we have a layer that's on top of another layer in Photoshop, the layer that's on top, we can control how we see through that layer. And so the most traditional sense would be how opaque is the layer, how transparent is the layer. Can we see straight through the layer, or do we have some semblance of one layer affecting the other layer below it? And in blending modes, it's a little bit more complicated than that, in that it's going to allow different mathematical formulas for what happens with that sheet. It would be essentially like having a photograph and covering it with a piece of white trace, or having a photograph and covering it with a piece of yellow trace, right? What you see through the two together are entirely different. And so blending modes are essentially doing the same thing, okay? Let's move forward a little bit. So there's various groups that kind of define blending modes. And so on the right here, I have an image that is our little shortcut context menu that drops down that we can pick from. Thus far, everything we've worked on is in the normal blending mode category. When we have layers, normal is, well, normal. Okay? As we move down, we have certain categories, and they're actually separated just like this in Photoshop. They have little dividers in between them. Okay? So the first category as we go down is something that generally darkens an image. So makes things darker. Okay? The most common one that we're going to use is called multiply. We'll go through that one today. Then we move down into the next section of 5, and we have things that are called lighten. And if we look here, okay, so we have darken, multiply, color burn, linear burn, darker color. Then we have lighten, kind of the opposite. Screen, kind of the opposite. Color dodge, right? Remember dodging and burning? Okay? Linear dodge, right? Linear burn, lighter color, darker color. It kind of makes sense. They correspond to each other. So they do similar things, just in reverse. Okay? But again, we're going to use multiply primarily. Guess what? We're going to use screen primarily. Okay? Tends to be the one that just works the best. But again, when you're going through this, you're going to experiment and see which ones work best and which ones don't work and that sort of thing. When we get down into this section, contrast, we're going to have changes in the dark and in the light and no change in the middle. Okay? So dark, light, both, so to speak. Okay? When we get down into here, these are some very specific blending modes that might be helpful if you were trying to, say, align some images together that were taken of the same photo but different exposures. There's some kind of tricky things that can happen in these. Very uncommon to use them for final output. Okay? They're more working blending modes than anything else. When we get down into what they call component, these are more specific, dealing with a very specific task. And so, for example, we're going to work on luminosity today, the purpose of which is to deal with contrast without oversaturating an image. And these are going to tend to apply not to a duplicate of a layer, but instead to an adjustment layer. So we're going to tend to drop one of these on an adjustment layer rather than on a direct duplicate of a layer. So let me try to explain how these work together. Oh, these are the most common ones. I kind of already pointed these out. Multiply and screen. And then in the contrast mode, we're going to use 2, overlay and soft light. Today we won't use soft light, but down the road in the semester we'll use soft light as well. So let's try to explain what's happening in the sample file that you're going to download. So I put these in kind of 3D so you can kind of see how they would apply together. Okay? Basically, we have 2 layers in the world of Photoshop. We have a layer that's all blue, and then on top of it, we have a layer that contains transparency, right? But also black, medium gray, white, and a gradient that goes from black to white. So if we switch our view around and look straight on at this image, this is what we're going to see. Okay? If we have the normal blending mode applied to the topmost layer, right? The topmost layer is 100% opaque, and we see the black, the 50% gray, the white, and obviously the gradient at the bottom. Okay? If instead we change that top layer to have a multiply blending mode, so remember multiply is in that first grouping, so it's going to be darkening the image, right? What it's going to do is it's going to take any area that's lighter on the layer, okay, is going to become transparent. So this white square is lighter on the top layer than it is on the bottom layer. Okay? That's going to become transparent. This, kind of in the middle tones, is going to be semi-transparent. And this is going to make things darker. They're going to be dark. So let's jump forward and see what happens when we apply it. Okay? Lo and behold, the white goes away. The medium kind of makes the blue a little bit darker, right? And the black makes the blue a lot darker. Okay? So that's multiply blending mode. And again, we'll do this all live so you can actually see what's happening. Okay? So screen, remember, opposite of multiply in the lighten category. Guess what's going to happen? The opposite. So things that are darker, the red square here, this is going to become transparent or semi-transparent, right? This will be semi-transparent, and this will stay white or will be lighter. Okay? So let's look at it. Okay? Now, I apologize, my black wasn't pure black. It was very, very dark gray. It was a mistake when I did the file. But you can see that this becomes almost entirely transparent, not quite fully transparent, right? Same thing, middle gray becomes a little bit lighter, and then we have the white being the lightest. Okay, so it's the opposite. Screen, opposite of multiply. Okay, so then we talked about the middle, right, which is in overlay mode. So if we're in overlay mode, the middle is now going to become transparent, and the darks are going to become darker, and the lights are going to become lighter. Okay, because it's in that third category. So let's take a look at it. Right? Middle goes to transparent, dark becomes darker, light becomes lighter. Okay? So let me switch over, and while I'm switching over to the actual live example, I want you to go to today's exercise 105, and the first part, in part 1, the first step is to download the blending modes sample file. Okay? So I want you to right click on that and say save link as, and then open it in Photoshop while I switch over. Okay, so we're switched over in computers here. Like I said, 8 slides, quick slideshow. Now we move into kind of the live example practice. And so what I want to have happen is I want you to go to the exercises. I want you to go to today's exercise under Spring 2016. And you're going to click on exercise 105. All right, and right here, under this first step, there's a ps-blendingmodes.psd. You're going to right-click on this file, and say Save Link As, and once it's done downloading, I want you to go ahead and open it up on your flash drive. Now, I already have it on my flash drive from this morning, so I don't need to go back and do it again. Let me go ahead and open that up in my Dropbox file here. And let me see where it is. There we go. It's the wrong one. There it is. All right, so you're going to see this file, okay, which is essentially the same one I had in lecture. So I want this to be up, and I'm going to wander around and make sure everybody has it, because this is a piece that I want to make sure you guys can follow along while I work with it. Okay, so we're going to continue now that all of you have it up. And I want to walk through kind of how blending modes work and how this particular file is set up. And then, of course, we'll do a bunch of examples kind of in how this pertains to photography. I would like to add, however, that blending modes, I think, are one of the most important things that you can learn as an architecture student relating to your post-processing work in Photoshop. I have some samples here that you're going to see and work with as part of this file. to where you'll see how you'll end up using it as we go forward in the semester, even though you haven't created these files yet. So let's look in the basics of the blending modes. And the first thing is a blending mode needs 2 layers to happen. Okay? And in this particular file, I have 4 layers. Layer 2 and layer 3 are currently turned off, which is fine. But I do have a background layer. Notice that the background layer has a lock next to it and is italicized. Okay? That means that I can't actually change anything that's on that layer. It's locked. Okay? The layer above it, called layer 1, is that file that I was talking about that has the black, the gray, the white, and the gradient. Okay? So if I were to turn off layer 1, I'd see just the blue square. Right? If I were to turn off the blue square, I would see just, let me switch here. I would see just the very dark gray. It was supposed to be black, the medium gray, and the white. Okay? So let me go ahead and turn on. So I have the background on, and I have layer 1 on. And I'm going to make sure that layer 1 is kind of highlighted in that pale blue color, meaning it's the active layer. It's the layer that I'm currently working with. Okay? Now when I have layer 1 actually on here, I can look up at the top of the layers palette, and I can see that I have something called normal. Okay? Well, this is that shortcut menu that gives me all of the various blending mode options. This is the exact menu you just saw on my slides. So remember, this first grouping darkens the image, the next grouping lightens the image, and the third grouping is both darken and lighten, but don't do anything to the center. So we're going to switch first to the multiply blending mode. And when I click on multiply here, it switches, right, so that what I'm seeing is a combination of layer 1 and the background layer. So they've actually combined together to create this particular image. Right? Effectively, what's happening is on this background layer, or excuse me, on this layer 1, which still has white on it, okay, when the white is lighter than whatever is in the background, right, the white goes away. When the black, or the dark gray, is darker than the shade of the background, right, it gets darker. And so you can see that this isn't actually black. It's kind of a very, very dark blue. So it's darkening the blue. Okay? If we switch this blending mode from multiply to screen, right, the opposite is going to happen. So the colors are still there. If we were to turn off the background, the black is still there, right? But because the black is darker than the blue, it's effectively going away, or very much lightening. You know, it's a tiny bit of lightening. Okay? The middle, which is that 50% gray, is kind of doing a medium amount of lightening, but we're seeing the blue shining through. And then the white is effectively white. Okay, so it's exactly the opposite. If we switch from screen mode, right, down here to overlay mode, which is the third option, okay, the middle is what stays neutral or transparent, right? And things that are lighter make the blue lighter. Things that are darker make the blue darker. Okay? So obviously I've gone over this, but what about from an architectural perspective? So I'm going to turn off layer 1 for a second, and we're going to turn on layer 2. And so behind layer 2, we still have the background, I still have it on, but this image is an export from SketchUp that is a basic line drawing as a JPEG. So when I make this basic line drawing export, I have a white image file, and I've got a bunch of black lines that show this weird piece of architecture, whatever it might be. Okay? It doesn't matter what it is. Okay? So you may have worked in 121, or you may have gotten an assignment where you needed to get rid of the background of an object like this. Right? You were trying to do a poster and you wanted the background to go away. Right? The logical thing would be to come in here and try to erase the white so that you could see through the background. So for example, I get the eraser out, and I could come in here, let me make the brush a little bit bigger, right? And I could go, okay, let me erase, and I'm seeing whatever it is in the background on the other side. Okay? But as I get in here really tight against the line, it's really hard to kind of, do it. Okay? So instead, I'm going to change the blending mode on layer 2. So if I go from normal to multiply, the first option, what that does is it makes all of the white become transparent, right? And it darkens up just the lines. Okay, so this is a great collaging technique when we get to that stage. Okay? Likewise, if I switched from multiply to screen, right, I'd get the white being solid, but I'd get transparency wherever the black was, which is effectively making all of my lines blue. Right? So I've switched my lines from being black to blue. Maybe it's something you want to do, maybe not. Right? Less useful. Okay? If I switch to the third option, to overlay mode, right, I get some combination of the two. The truth is that this is probably the least valuable of the blending modes from an architectural drawing standpoint. Okay? So let's turn that one off and turn on layer 3. Okay? So up here at layer 3, I have the opposite. I have a black drawing or a black page with white lines. Okay? So if I switch from normal to multiply, okay, the dark's going to get darker and the blue is going to shine through. Now on the screen you can almost barely see this. On your screens you'll probably see it a little bit better than I can. Again, not that valuable. Okay? But if we switch to screen mode, for example, right, what is black goes away and the white lines shine onto this blue surface, which is more like a blueprint look. Okay? So maybe this is a look that you're going for, I don't know. Right? The truth is that the black background is less useful than the white, but I wanted to at least show you how it goes through. And then we can move on to the last one, overlay. Again, probably the least useful. It's kind of a combination of the two. A little bit lighter lines, a little bit darker blue. Don't know how useful it really is. Okay? But I like to include this as part of what you're doing in the sample file so that you can see where we will ultimately be going with this. Right? We'll be doing SketchUp modeling, we'll be bringing it in, and we'll be able to use the lines as live lines like this. Okay? So now let's start to look at this from a photography standpoint. Right? Thus far, the things that I've shown you are more, architectural compositing techniques. Okay? But let's try to do this on an actual image. So what I'm going to do is I'm moving on. You didn't have to save anything for part 1. Those are just demonstration purposes. I'm going to move down into the part 2 section, and I'm going to work with some kind of an old faded photograph. So I happen to have a bunch on my flash drive because I've been doing this lecture long enough to have a bunch of samples, but you'll probably need to go search for it. And I'm going to show you how I would go about searching for it. Rather than just doing a basic Google image search, it's nice when we're working in this realm to, instead of doing Google image search, to actually do something that people have allowed you to work with the images. So we're not going to run into any copyright infringements or anything like that. So I use what's called search.creativecommons.org. And this is a way of establishing a search page for work that people have allowed you to work for or work with. So right here, under the query, it says, I want something that I can, and I've checked the box for modify, adapt, or build upon. Right? So whoever owns the image has put it out on the internet free for me to be able to work with. Okay? Now, the caveat to this is that I'm supposed to link back to the file, the original file, right? Just so that you know where it came from. And so you'll see later on I ask you to save that information and create the links. So again, search.creativecommons.org. Okay? And then under this search query, I'm going to type old photograph. Okay? Now, I have the ability to search Google Images. I could have the ability to search Flickr images, right, by clicking on the Flickr, and it's going to take me to one or the other. I'm always amazed at the fact that when I do this search on Flickr images, the images that show up are always entirely different. So what I worked with before is going to be different from what I'm working with today. Let me actually, for the fun of it, since I did Flickr this morning, I'll do Google Images for right now. Right? And I'm looking for an image that's kind of faded that I'm going to try to improve. Right? That's probably a little bit too faded for me to fix. Right? So as I come down here, things with high contrast I'm going to avoid, and I'm going to work with something that kind of has medium or poor contrast. Something like this is not a bad place to start. Right? Looks a little better on your screen than it does on mine. I'll go ahead and click on View Image so that I can see the actual image, and then we'll go ahead and save this image as. And let me put it on my flash drive into today's folder. And actually, let me create a new folder for this evening. And I'll go ahead and paste this into place. Or excuse me, I'll just save it right here. Okay, so like I said, I have a bunch of examples. I'm going to pull up more than one option today as we go through this. And so let's pull up that first option. So in Photoshop, I'm going to File and then Open. And then I'm going to go to today's folder, and I'll pick that photo that I just picked. All right, so there it is. It's funny, it actually looks better on the screen than it does on my screen. Weird. Okay, so first rule of blending modes was I have to have two layers in order to actually do or apply a blending mode. So if I look at my layers palette right now, all I have is a background layer that's locked. I don't have two layers. Okay? So I need to make sure that I have a second layer. So I'm going to right-click on this background layer, and I'm going to say Duplicate Layer. Okay? And when I select Duplicate Layer, I'll get a second copy. It'll say Background Copy. And now I have two copies of the same image. Okay? So this first one here, I'm going to double-click, and I'm going to rename it to be Multiply, because I'm going to apply the Multiply blending mode. Okay? So there it is. And I'm going to take this, highlighted in blue, and I'm going to switch the blending mode from Normal to Multiply. And when I do that, the shadows of the image become much darker. Okay? Now, in this particular context, they probably became too dark. Okay? So I can fix that by coming up here, and you see where Multiply is. Next to it is something called Opacity. Okay? And the opacity is at 100% right now. If I click on the opacity level, and I slide this slider down, right, you'll see that I can control how much of that blending mode, how much darkening is actually happening. Okay? So in this context, maybe something like that is about the right amount. Now, there's no right and wrong answer, right, for what I'm doing. It's to your eye as to excuse me, as to what looks good to you, right? I'm going to open up another file just so that you can see another option. One of the things about doing this is that depending on what file you're working with, the settings are going to be slightly different. Okay? So let me open up this file. Okay? And so in this context, I want to darken up. I want to see more information in the sky up here in the clouds. So if I duplicate the layer, so once again, I'll duplicate the layer. Okay? And then I'll change the background copy. I'm going to do a multiply. And I'm going to change the blending mode here to multiply. And we'll see that suddenly I get a bunch of clouds in the sky that I couldn't see before. Right? So there it was before. There it is after. Much better sky. Okay? I'm probably getting too much down here in the trees for my liking. It's becoming very shadowy down there. But you can see where multiply can be a very effective way of transforming, right, how the sky works here. Okay? So in part 2, I'm asking you for 2 images that you're going to ultimately post. One is the original image, and one is the corrected image. Right? So in this case, let's say I was going to use this image. I would turn off the multiply layer, and I'd start with the original. And I'm going to go to File, Save for Web. Oops, sorry. File, Save for Web. And I'm going to cut my image size down. So the smaller value we'll put at 600, because I just don't need the size to be that large. This is actually a huge file. And then I'll go ahead and click Save. And we'll put it in an output folder for today. And this will be original. And I'll go ahead and click Save. And then I'll turn on the multiply. There it is with the multiply. And I'll go to File, Save for Web, and repeat this process. Again, smaller value, I'll set at 600. I'll click Save. And this is now multiply. And I'll go ahead and click Save. Okay? So now I'm going to move on into part 3, where I'm going to ask you to do something with the screen blending mode. So let me open another file. And again, you'll browse and find another file, but I already have enough here. Let me take this photo. Okay? And this time, I'm going to go ahead and use the screen option. Okay? So once again, I'll duplicate the background layer. So I'm going to right-click on background, say duplicate layer. Okay, there it is. Then on the background copy layer, this blue layer, I'm going to switch into screen mode. Right? And when I do that, right, like the detail that's up here in the eave of this building, right, or maybe some of the detail that's in the shadows here, now becomes visible. Now we could argue in this particular context, maybe this is too much, right? I'm getting too much, it's too light of a file. In which case, once again, I can change the opacity level, and I can control how much detail I get back in there. Okay? This one might not be showing as well. Let me use this one as an example. I'm going to duplicate the layer again, and we're going to call this one screen. And I'm going to change the blending mode to screen. And you can see, especially if I zoom in here a bit, the detail in the trees is definitely enhanced. Right? So there it is without. Kind of this black all kind of runs together. And when I do the screen mode, it gets lighter, and we see a little bit more detail in the trees. Okay? So that's with screen. We'll leave this one as my example. So once again, I do file save for web twice. So I'd have an original and a screen mode. Okay? So let's move forward into part 4, which is where we're going to do an overlay, which is a combination of the two. And so let me go ahead and open a file again. Actually, I'll come back to this corner. Well, no. Let me open a different one. Let me see here. Yeah, let's use this one. Let me go ahead and rotate this image because it wasn't rotated here. All right, so there it is. Another example. Okay? I'm going to use, this time, something that darkens the darks and lightens the lights to get a little bit more out of both sides of this particular image. So I've taken the original. I'm going to duplicate my background layer. Duplicate layer. All right, and this is now going to be an overlay. And we're going to change the blending mode all the way down here to overlay. Okay? And so that was a fairly dramatic change, actually. So we had the original, which was a little bit muted. And when I drop the overlay blending mode on top of it, I get a lot more enhancements in the shadows, but I also got a lot better highlights on this particular image as well. So it's dealing with contrast. It's looking much, much better than it was from original to enhanced. Okay? So it's a relatively easy concept or easy thing to execute. Right? It's just a matter of knowing that these exist. So let me go ahead and I'll save these just as I did before. We'll start with the background, file, save for web. And clearly I'm making Photoshop hate me. Right, let's cut this file size down to 600. And I'm actually going to hit cancel when I'm done here because we don't need this to, you don't need to watch me save it. I think you guys know how to save by now. And so you'll save the original and then you'll save the processed one. Okay, so thus far we've worked primarily with old photographs, but these techniques still would apply to your new photographs. So if you don't like the old photographs for these and you want to use one of your photographs and try it, that's not a problem. Okay? But when we move into part 5, we definitely want to use something that is a new photograph, and we don't want one that's in black and white. Okay? Ideally, for the luminosity that we're going to do, we want something with a lot of color in it. And so I have a couple examples that I'll pull up here, but I had one that a student did earlier today. So if I can find the image, I'll try to use that, because it was a particularly vibrant illustration. Let's do like this one. Okay, I'm going to take this file here as one of my examples. All right, so let me go ahead and open that yellow sunset, and I'm hoping that this will show up on the screen. If it doesn't, I'm going to do this with a couple other images, and we'll see if I can get one to show up on the screen really nicely. Okay, so there's the colored image of the sunset that I picked. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and, unlike the last ones where we just duplicated the layer, right? So last time I went to duplicate layer, and then I applied, say, the overlay mode, right? And we get the end result. So again, this works just fine with the colored image. That's not exactly what I want. So I'm going to go ahead this time, and I'm going to apply a new layer adjustment. So I'm going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves, just like we did last class, right? And I'm going to peg the center, and I'm going to drag this up slightly, and I'm going to drag this down slightly. Right? Now what this does is it gives me a little bit better contrast kind of in the shadows, and it gives us a little bit more drama in this particular image. Okay? But the cost of that drama is a lot more saturation. See how the yellow is almost like too yellow now? Okay? It's too much saturation. So, excuse me. I'm going to take this adjustment layer right here, and I'm going to change the blending mode of the adjustment layer to be luminosity. And when I do that, you're going to see that that brightness or the oversaturation of the yellow is going to go back to the way it was before, but I'm going to retain the drama or the dark and light contrasts that are available in the clouds and on the horizon here. Okay? So it's kind of a great melding of the two. So there was my original. There it is with a little bit more drama, but I haven't oversaturated the color. Okay? So it's a really nice way of adding a little bit more drama to a sunset. So let me go ahead and open another one so you can see this again. Let's pick this one. Oops, this one. All right, so here's another example of a sunset, California coast sunset, right? And if I were to go in and do the same, layer, new adjustment layer, curves. And again, I'm going to peg this as a traditional S curve. So I peg the center, I pull this upper section up, and I pull the lower section down, right? I get some really nice drama, right? Get some really nice blacks in there, a lot of nice contrast in the clouds, but the colors, again, are becoming too oversaturated, too much color. So I'll take this curves and I'll change it to have an adjustment layer, or excuse me, a blending mode of luminosity. And when I do that, the saturation of the color goes away, but the contrast stays, right? So it's a subtle difference, and when you actually do this live on one of your own photos, you'll start to see the difference on screen much more than you did before. So there it was without, and there it is with. Much better contrast, especially in the waves and the water. It's a much richer photo. Okay? But I haven't gone to the point where my colors are oversaturated. Okay? So it's this great melding of the two. Okay? I'll do one more example. Right? And what we're looking for in the original image is an image that's dominated by reds and or blues. Right? So I have an image here. This one has a lot of reds kind of here in the ground, a lot of deep blues or grays up in the skies here. Right? So I'll do the same thing with this image. I'll go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves, and I'll peg the center, and I'll peg a point here, and we'll pull that up a little bit, and I'll peg a point here, and we'll pull that down a little bit. Okay? So you can see that it's definitely pushed the contrast of that image quite a bit. Okay? But it's also oversaturated the color. So once again, I'll take this layer, and I'll change the blending mode to luminosity, and I will retain the contrast without the oversaturation of color. So the color stays the same, it's just the contrast that increases. Okay? So this is a really great technique for these kinds of photos. Right? Now, maybe I push this into the bounds of being a little bit surrealistic. Right? Maybe it didn't quite look like this when I shot the photo. So maybe I take the opacity down on this adjustment layer just a little bit so it's not quite as much drama. Right? The truth is that when it was there, it was kind of a lot like this. It was a weird, stormy, rainy place. Anyway, very cool. This is up in the Tahoe Sierras at one of the backcountry lakes, as a side note. Okay, so that was part 5. So again, original image plus the post-processed. Okay, so thus far, part 2, there's 2 images. Part 3, there's 2 images. Part 4, there's 2 images. Part 5, there's 2 images. That gets us to 8 total images. Okay, we're going to move forward, flipping it over to part 6. Okay, and so part 6 is a little bit more of an artistic flair on the traditional post-processing. And that is that we're going to take something called a grunge texture, and we're going to apply that behind our photograph. And so I'll use this as my example. I can actually turn off the curves altogether, and then I will apply a grunge texture. So the first thing that I need to do is I need to look for a grunge texture. And so we can come back to my Creative Commons search here, and I can type in grunge texture. Right? And I'll go ahead and do a Google image search this time. I did Flickr this morning, so we'll do Google image search. And lo and behold, a lot of the results that come up are kind of dirty walls, concretes, right? Papers, wrinkled papers, that kind of thing. Okay? So I'm going to use this wrinkled paper right here as an example, and maybe I'll pick one of the other ones to do a second example on. So let me go ahead and click this, and I'll view the image. There's that dirty piece of paper, right? Kind of wrinkled. I'm going to right-click on it, and I'm going to say Save Image As. And we'll save it into my folder here. There it is. And so now I'm going to come back to Photoshop. And I need a way of getting this image into the scene to begin with. Okay? So I have 2 different ways of doing this in Photoshop. I can open the file and then select it, copy it, and then paste it. Or I can do something called placing the image. And placing an image is a referencing file. So I'm going to say, yes, I want to attach one file to another. If you've worked in AutoCAD, it's essentially the same thing as an XREF. InDesign is full of image placements. Right? That's the large part of what we do in InDesign. So you will, if you're not familiar with placing, you will get very familiar with it in about 3 weeks. Right? You'll start doing a lot of image placing. Okay? But for right now, we're going to go to the File menu, and we're going to select Place. There we go. And I'm going to go to Tonight, and I'm going to pick that wrinkled paper texture, and I'll go ahead and click on Place. Okay, now when that comes in, the image itself is really, really tiny, unfortunately, so I need to make it bigger. So I can grab one of the corners and make that image bigger, okay, without too much effort. Now, I don't care so much, because this is just a grunge texture, if it gets skewed a bit. Okay? But if I wanted it to stay in proportion, if it was something other than a background texture, I would hold down Shift as I made it bigger to maintain the proportions of this particular image. Okay? So again, I'm holding down Shift, and I'm dragging, and there it is. Okay? So I make it large enough to cover my overall scene, or my overall image, and then I'll check this box up here to say, yes, I'm comfortable with the size, so we'll go ahead and say OK. So now, okay, I'm going to start working with this linked image file. Right? It's actually called a smart object in the world of Photoshop. And I can tell that it's a smart object because over here on the layer, right, I have this little file icon that's on top of it. You guys see that? Okay? This means that this layer, or this object, is a smart object. It's a referenced file. It's not actually contained within the Photoshop file. It's a reference to that file that I saved on my flash drive. Okay? We can do a lot of processing without ever actually embedding the image into the Photoshop file. So for example, what we're going to do right now is I'm going to go to the blending mode, and I'm going to change to multiply. Okay, now notice that I didn't have to do anything with the fact that it was a referenced file, but when I change the blending mode, the wrinkled paper is now very much up here in the sky. It almost looks as though I printed this on a piece of paper, wrinkled it, and then took a picture of it. Okay? Now maybe this is a bit strong, so maybe I'll change the opacity down. So it's slightly wrinkled, maybe something like that. Again, it's whatever looks right to your particular eye. Okay? Now, if the multiply blending mode wasn't really what we wanted, we could try screen, which is going to lighten the image. Right? Maybe we need to darken this up a little bit. Maybe we need to really lighten it, right, to see what the right piece is. I actually believe that I suggest screen, though in this case I think multiply looks a lot better. So use whatever feels right. Right? Likewise, I could pick overlay, which is some combination of the two, which may or may not look right the way you want it to. At some point it will. Maybe something like that. Okay? So at this point, you're going to save your original file here and your grunge textured file. Right? Again, if I was unhappy with this particular grunge texture, I could come back and I could pick some other grunge texture. You know, maybe it was this one, right? I don't know. And I could again view the image, and then I could save this image. Depending on your original, the image that you pick as the grunge texture might change. This one's probably not the best because it has such a strong seam in it. I don't think it would work as well. Okay, but again, I could pick any of these that I wanted to. Any of these kinds of concrete ones tend to work pretty nicely. The paper ones, these kind look pretty nice too. Okay, this one would just dirty up the image, make it look less clean. Okay, so you're going to save an original for this and a modified version. Okay, so one with the grunge texture. Okay, now it would be incomplete if I didn't actually show you where this can go as we would push the boundaries of this a little bit more. But at the same time, it's a bit more than you can take in one day. So the 10 images that you just created, or are going to create in the way that I did these, are all that's required for posting today. Okay? So we've got, as we go through this, we have 2 images for multiply, 2 images for screen, 2 images for overlay, 2 images for luminosity, and 2 images for grunge. That gets us to 10 images total. Okay? But I want to show you a little bit more of what Photoshop can do in this realm, just so that you can feel a little bit more of what happens. Okay? So let's say that I had a nice picture of a sunset that didn't have any clouds in it. Okay? Let me go ahead and open one that looks something like that. All right? So I had a nice picture of a sunset, looks nice, but there's no clouds in the sky. Well, there's one little itty bitty tiny one. Okay? And let's say that I wanted to add clouds into the sky. Okay? What I need to do is I need to find an image that has clouds in it. So I can go again to image search, and I could look for cloudy sky or clouds, something like that. Right? And I could find an image, hopefully one that's of about the right scale, with about a similar horizon line. Right? It doesn't help me to get too high. Right? Something like this maybe. Go ahead and view the image. Oops. Apparently it's just downloading it for me. So here, let me go ahead and show in the folder. There it is. Let me copy it, put it in my flash drive here. There it is. And let me jump back to Photoshop for a second. So here it is. Here's my example. And let me go ahead and go to File and then Place. So exactly like I did before with the referenced image. And let me pick the one that I just found with the clouds in it. And we'll go ahead and place that in place. Okay, it's actually a similar sized image. But I'd really like the horizons to match up a little bit more. So we'll pick it maybe more, I don't know, more like that or so. Okay. So again, I've got 2 images, one on top of the other. Right? And let's go through and see what happens here. Let's say I go to multiply. Okay? Now, lo and behold, suddenly I have clouds in my sky, right? Where I had a cloudless sky, something like this, I now have something with clouds in it, okay, which might add a little bit more drama to this particular scene, right? So there are some problems with this, and I'm going to throw a quick adjustment layer on this just so that you can see this a little bit better on screen. Okay, so again, much lighter than I would intend. But as I drop these together, see how I have the tail image of the second image that's down here, right? Not something that I wanted to show. I need to get rid of that. So I'm going to use a layer mask, which is what we're going to talk about next class, to get rid of it. So I'm going to work on this layer mask. And again, if this is not making sense to you, don't worry. We're going to spend a lot more time working on it. But what a layer mask will allow me to do is it'll actually allow me to paint off parts of, whoops, wrong one, parts of the image that I don't want to have shown. So let me go ahead and paint this off. Like that. And then let me go ahead and turn off my adjustment so those clouds or the mistakes aren't actually happening in this photo. Right, something like that. Okay, so I end up with a nice image that has these clouds in it, right? And I could push the envelope a little bit more. I could do some further adjustments with some specialized masking to push these a little bit further. But the point that you should take away with something like this is that you are constantly bombarded with images, right? From advertising, you walk around, you see billboards, you see all this stuff all the time. Okay, the likelihood of the image that you're seeing being the actual original image is very slim, right? You can see that with a couple clicks, I was able to take what was a sunset and make it something that was entirely different sunset just because I wanted to. Okay? Photoshop is an extraordinarily powerful tool that will let you bend reality a lot. Okay? Thus far, we've done a lot of the basics of just enhancing the image to make the image look better. As we go forward from here, from tonight, you're going to start doing things that bend reality, right? Bend what actually happens into something that you want to show as happening. Okay? So we're going to transition in that way, and I'm going to show you how to create these masks such that this kind of thing is relatively easy. Okay? So I just wanted to kind of push of where we're going. For example, if you, and you can actually do this on Google image search really easily, right? If you do Photoshop retouching, before and after, you can very quickly see how with just a little bit of Photoshop, you could take one person and transform that person into somebody else. Right? Very, very easy to do. Right? You can get rid of blemishes, facial blemishes. Right? So there's a lot of things that you can do that can take one thing and make it another. Okay? Even something as simple as this, you can transform quite a bit. Okay? So we're going to continue showing you the bending the realities of what's possible as we go forward, but I at least wanted to kind of show you that's where we're going. Okay? Are there any questions about blending modes? Not yet? Okay? I'm going to turn you loose and let you do it. Remember, this part is not something that's required. It's just something that I wanted to show you that you could do. Okay?